This is the story of Archelaus, a ruler who thought he could hold power forever, but learned that God's guidance steers us even through dangerous leadership. Once upon a time, a baby king was carried on a dusty road under a blazing sun. His mother held him close, whispering prayers into his tiny ear. His father led the donkey carefully, glancing over his shoulder every few steps. They were fleeing, not from wild animals or storms, but from a man who wore a crown and believed that fear was stronger than love. That man was Herod the Great. And in his giant shadow stood his son, Archelaus. Years later, Archelaus sat alone in a long, echoing hall inside his father's old palace. He didn't sit on a throne. He sat on the cold floor, legs crossed as if he was a boy again. All around him, golden bowls and tapestries shimmered, but he barely looked at them. He stared at a small dagger in his hand, turning it slowly. The dagger had belonged to his father, a symbol of power, or so he was told. But to Archelaus, it felt heavy, as if it carried all his father's secrets. He thought about his childhood, learning to keep his head down, to watch for sudden outbursts, to nod and smile when soldiers came with bad news. He had grown up in dark rooms and loud dinners, where laughter sounded more like barking dogs. When Herod died, Archelaus thought he would finally be free to lead the people his own way. But freedom felt like a trap. The people distrusted him. The priests challenged him. The Romans watched him. Every prayer in the temple seemed to echo against his heart. His father had ruled with terror. Archelaus tried the same, but something deep inside him twisted every time he ordered another punishment or silenced another protest. And then there was the rumor that never left his mind, the rumor of the baby king. The child who escaped into Egypt, the one Herod had failed to destroy. Even after all these years, Archelaus felt haunted by that baby's silent footsteps echoing in his dreams. He tightened his grip on the dagger. What if that child returned, he thought. What if the people followed him instead of me? What if they rose up, shouting for this gentle king instead of fearing my soldiers? The thought burned in his chest. In the hallway outside, servants moved quietly, afraid to disturb him. Birds sang outside the open windows, but Archelaus heard only the pounding of his own heart. While he planned new strategies to hold on to power far beyond his reach, God was leading the baby king home, guiding Joseph and Mary safely past Judea, past the traps and threats, to a quiet place called Nazareth. Archelaus didn't know that the more he clutched power, the more he lost it. He didn't see that true kingship wasn't built on fear and force, but on love and surrender. As the afternoon light stretched across the floor, Archelaus sat alone with his dagger, lost in dark thoughts of control and suspicion. Meanwhile, in a simple home far away, a boy king was growing up strong and wise. A king no one could stop. Archelaus rose from the cold floor, his legs stiff from sitting so long. He slipped the dagger into his belt, as if it gave him strength just to feel its weight at his side. In the dim hallway, he could hear the shuffle of sandals and the low murmur of guards. Every sound made him flinch. He snapped his fingers sharply, and a servant scurried into view, head bowed so low his forehead almost touched the floor. "Bring the council," Archelaus ordered, his voice dry and sharp. "Now!" The servant fled without a word. Archelaus began pacing, his cloak dragging behind him like a shadow. He pressed his palm against the stone walls as if he was checking they were still there, still his. Deep inside, a small knot of fear twisted tighter with every step. He could almost hear whispers behind the walls, whispers of the baby king, of families who still hoped for a different ruler, of people who believed in a kingdom of peace rather than iron swords. Moments later, a line of elders and priests filed into the hall, eyes darting nervously. Archelaus didn't let them speak first. "I hear the temple crowds are growing again," he said, turning to face them all at once. His gaze swept across their faces, searching for signs of disloyalty. A thin elder with a long gray beard opened his mouth but hesitated. Archelaus stepped forward. "Out with it!" Archelaus snapped. The elder swallowed. They say the people are praying for deliverance. They speak of a king, not you, my lord, but a king who would bring justice and mercy." Archelaus felt the words slam into him like a fist. His hand drifted to the dagger at his belt. "Mercy," he repeated slowly, his lips curling. "That is weakness. My father knew that. He taught me well." Silence pressed into the hall like a heavy fog. Archelaus looked around, eyes shining with something wild. "If they want to dream of another king, let them dream in silence. I will not have their foolish hopes spreading through my city like a disease." A young priest stepped forward, trembling. "My lord, perhaps if you offered them kindness, they would—" Archelaus cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Kindness? Did kindness build these walls? Did kindness keep the Romans at bay?" His voice grew louder with each word, echoing into the corners of the room. The priest stepped back quickly, his face pale. Archelaus turned away, gripping a window ledge so hard his knuckles turned white. He stared out into the fading daylight, imagining rebels hiding in shadows, families telling stories of another king by candlelight, children dreaming of someone gentler and stronger. "They will fear me," he whispered to himself. "They must." As night fell, torches flickered along the palace walls. The elders left in silence, their heads low. In the darkness, Archelaus stood alone with his dagger, haunted by a king he could not see, a king he could not understand. The baby who had slipped away so many years before, carried in secret by parents guided by God himself. Archelaus did not know it yet, but no wall was high enough, no sword sharp enough to stop the true king's quiet return. Days turned into restless nights, and Archelaus's fear only grew. He ordered more guards at the temple gates, stationed soldiers along narrow alleys, and sent spies into prayer gatherings. Each morning, reports piled up like stones in his mind. People refusing to bow, whispers of another king, families moving away in the middle of the night. In the grand dining hall, Archelaus sat alone at a long table. Golden plates sat untouched. He tapped one finger against his dagger again and again, the metal's cold edge grounding him in his spiraling thoughts. A messenger entered quietly, holding a clay tablet. His eyes flicked nervously to the floor as he approached. "My lord," the messenger said, voice barely above a whisper, "the people. They refuse your new taxes. They say they can't give to a ruler who rules with fear." Archelaus stood so quickly his chair toppled over and clattered across the marble floor. "They refuse me?" he roared, his voice crashing off the walls like thunder. "Who do they think feeds them? Protects them? Keeps the Romans from swallowing them whole?" The messenger trembled so hard he nearly dropped the tablet. Archelaus grabbed it from his hands and flung it across the room, watching it shatter against a column. His breathing came fast and ragged. Outside the palace walls, though, the city had begun to change in ways he couldn't control. Families gathered in small courtyards at night, lighting tiny lamps and telling stories, not of Archelaus, but of a coming king. a different kind of king. A man named Joseph returned quietly from Egypt, leading his family into the north, into a small town called Nazareth. The child, now walking and laughing, grew under God's watchful eye, far from Archelaus' reach. In Jerusalem, prayers turned softer but stronger. People shared bread and whispered words of hope in corners, teaching children to wait for the one true king. Archelaus could not see these moments. He saw only shadows and threats. He ordered more arrests, more punishments, thinking he could scare loyalty back into the people's hearts. But the more he pushed, the more they slipped away. One evening, as the sky turned a deep violet, Archelaus stood in his private chamber, staring into a bronze mirror. His reflection looked back, eyes hollow, hair wild, shoulders tense. He touched the glass gently. "Am I truly king?" he whispered, "or just another man chasing shadows?" His voice faded into the dark, swallowed by the silent walls. Meanwhile, in a small home far away, the baby king, now a growing boy, played by a doorway, carving shapes in the dirt, watched over by a mother's gentle eyes and a father's steady hands. And though Archelaus held a crown and a palace, true power had already slipped through his fingers. Days turned into restless nights, and Archelaus's fear only grew. He ordered more guards at the temple gates, stationed soldiers along narrow alleys, and sent spies into prayer gatherings. Each morning, reports piled up like stones in his mind. People refusing to bow, whispers of another king, families moving away in the middle of the night. In the grand dining hall, Archelaus sat alone at a long table. Golden plates sat untouched. He tapped one finger against his dagger again and again, the metal's cold edge grounding him in his spiraling thoughts. A messenger entered quietly, holding a clay tablet. His eyes flicked nervously to the floor as he approached. "My lord," the messenger said, voice barely above a whisper, "the people. They refuse your new taxes. They say they can't give to a ruler who rules with fear." Archelaus stood so quickly his chair toppled over and clattered across the marble floor. "They refuse me," he roared, his voice crashing off the walls like thunder. "Who do they think feeds them? Protects them? Keeps the Romans from swallowing them whole?" The messenger trembled so hard he nearly dropped the tablet. Archelaus grabbed it from his hands and flung it across the room, watching it shatter against a column. His breathing came fast and ragged. Outside the palace walls, though, the city had begun to change in ways he couldn't control. Families gathered in small courtyards at night, lighting tiny lamps and telling stories, not of Archelaus, but of a coming king, a different kind of king. A man named Joseph returned quietly from Egypt, leading his family into the north, into a small town called Nazareth. The child, now walking and laughing, grew under God's watchful eye, far from Archelaus' reach. In Jerusalem, prayers turned softer but stronger. People shared bread and whispered words of hope in corners, teaching children to wait for the one true king. Archelaus could not see these moments. He saw only shadows and threats. He ordered more arrests, more punishments, thinking he could scare loyalty back into the people's hearts. But the more he pushed, the more they slipped away. One evening, as the sky turned a deep violet, Archelaus stood in his private chamber, staring into a bronze mirror. His reflection looked back, eyes hollow, hair wild, shoulders tense. He touched the glass gently. "Am I truly king?" he whispered, "or just another man chasing shadows?" His voice faded into the dark, swallowed by the silent walls. Meanwhile, in a small home far away, the baby king, now a growing boy, played by a doorway, carving shapes in the dirt, watched over by a mother's gentle eyes and a father's steady hands. And though Archelaus held a crown and a palace, true power had already slipped through his fingers. Days turned into restless nights, and Archelaus's fear only grew. He ordered more guards at the temple gates, stationed soldiers along narrow alleys, and sent spies into prayer gatherings. Each morning, reports piled up like stones in his mind. People refusing to bow, whispers of another king, families moving away in the middle of the night. In the grand dining hall, Archelaus sat alone at a long table. Golden plates sat untouched. He tapped one finger against his dagger again and again, the metal's cold edge grounding him in his spiraling thoughts. A messenger entered quietly, holding a clay tablet. His eyes flicked nervously to the floor as he approached. "My lord," the messenger said, voice barely above a whisper, "the people. They refuse your new taxes. They say they can't give to a ruler who rules with fear." Archelaus stood so quickly his chair toppled over and clattered across the marble floor. "They refuse me?" he roared, his voice crashing off the walls like thunder. "Who do they think feeds them? Protects them? Keeps the Romans from swallowing them whole?" The messenger trembled so hard he nearly dropped the tablet. Archelaus grabbed it from his hands and flung it across the room, watching it shatter against a column. His breathing came fast and ragged. Outside the palace walls, though, the city had begun to change in ways he couldn't control. Families gathered in small courtyards at night, lighting tiny lamps and telling stories, not of Archelaus, but of a coming king, a different kind of king. A man named Joseph returned quietly from Egypt, leading his family into the north into a small town called Nazareth. The child, now walking and laughing, grew under God's watchful eye, far from Archelaus's reach. In Jerusalem, prayers turned softer but stronger. People shared bread and whispered words of hope in corners, teaching children to wait for the one true king. Archelaus could not see these moments. He saw only shadows and threats. He ordered more arrests, more punishments, thinking he could scare loyalty back into the people's hearts. But the more he pushed, the more they slipped away. One evening, as the sky turned a deep violet, Archelaus stood in his private chamber, staring into a bronze mirror. His reflection looked back, eyes hollow, hair wild, shoulders tense. He touched the glass gently. "Am I truly king?" he whispered. "Or just another man, chasing shadows?" His voice faded into the dark, swallowed by the silent walls. Meanwhile, in a small home far away, the baby king, now a growing boy, played by a doorway, carving shapes in the dirt, watched over by a mother's gentle eyes and a father's steady hands. And though Archelaus held a crown and a palace, true power had already slipped through his fingers. Night fell heavy over the palace like a thick blanket. Archelaus wandered through the empty halls, his sandals scraping against the cold stone floor. The grand rooms that once rang with loud feasts and echoing orders now felt like caves, echoing only his own footsteps. He carried a small oil lamp in one hand and his father's old dagger in the other. Every few steps he paused and looked over his shoulder as if expecting someone to be there. But there was never anyone. He entered the throne room and set the lamp on the floor. The shadows danced up the high walls, turning tapestries and pillars into towering shapes that seemed to watch him. Archelaus stood in front of the empty throne, breathing hard. "All I ever wanted was to be strong," he whispered into the darkness. "To make them respect me, to make them fear me enough that they'd never leave." His voice cracked as it bounced off the stone. But no matter what I do, they slip away. They whisper about another king, a king who would be gentle, who would heal instead of punish, who would love them instead of scare them. His mind burned with images he couldn't push away. A baby carried under starlight, a father leading a donkey into the dark, a mother's soft songs in the night. That baby, the one his father had hunted, still haunted him. Archelaus felt as if that small child stood in every corner, watching quietly, stronger than any sword or army. He turned in circles, dagger raised as if he could cut away the memories. "Show yourself," he shouted into the shadows. "Face me. You think you're stronger than me. You think they'll choose you over me." But the only answer was the gentle flicker of the lamp and the soft sigh of the wind moving through the cracks in the palace walls. Archelaus dropped to his knees in front of the empty throne. His dagger clattered onto the floor, ringing through the room. "I don't understand," he whispered, tears slipping down his face. "I don't understand how they could love someone they've never seen, someone who doesn't wear a crown or hold a blade." Outside, the moon rose higher, shining down on the quiet city. In faraway Nazareth, the young Jesus slept soundly, his small chest rising and falling. The world was preparing for him, even if it didn't know it yet. And in his hollow palace, Archelaus finally felt it. The deep, empty ache of a man who ruled everything but had nothing. He didn't know it yet, but the true king's quiet strength would outlive all his walls and weapons. Morning came gray and restless. Archelaus stood in the courtyard, staring at the soldiers lined up before him. Their armor glinted dully in the pale light, and their eyes flickered from side to side. None dared look directly at him for long. He paced in front of them, his cloak snapping in the wind. "You will search every corner of this city," he barked, his voice sharp and ragged. "Every courtyard, every alley, every hidden room where they whisper about this so-called coming king." A captain stepped forward, head low. "My lord, we've already searched. We find no sign of rebellion, only families praying and children learning stories." Archelaus's face turned red. "Stories," he spat. "Those stories will turn into swords. They plant seeds of defiance, and you stand here doing nothing." He turned away abruptly, eyes wild as if he were talking to ghosts. "They want a gentle king," he muttered under his breath. "A healer, a shepherd. But they forget a king needs to be strong. Strong enough to crush traitors before they rise." The soldiers exchanged worried glances. The captain shifted his feet but said nothing. Archelaus marched up the palace steps, stopping halfway to glance back. "If you fail me again," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger, "you'll join the traitors in the dungeons." He stormed inside, slamming the heavy doors behind him. In the silent corridors, he pressed his back against the cold wall, breathing fast. He could hear distant footsteps echoing, or maybe they were only in his mind. He thought again of the baby king, now a boy somewhere beyond his reach. Archelaus imagined those small hands growing strong, those gentle eyes turning fierce with truth. "Where is he?" he whispered to the empty hallway. "Why can't I find him? Why can't I stop him before it's too late?" But even as he asked, Archelaus knew deep down this king wasn't hiding out of fear. He was waiting, growing, for a different kind of kingdom. Outside, the people continued their quiet prayers. Families shared simple meals, telling their children about a savior who would not arrive with soldiers, but with love. And each day, Archelaus's rule felt thinner, like a fraying rope. The guards began to slip away at night, one by one, Some joined their families. Others fled the city altogether, refusing to enforce his cruel orders. By the next morning, Archelaus would discover his army was smaller, his council even quieter, and his throne colder than ever. And as the sun set that night, he sat alone in the great hall, clutching the dagger against his chest, a man who thought he could hold a kingdom with fear, but who was left with only shadows. Archelaus woke before dawn, the palace halls echoing with an eerie stillness. He threw open the heavy doors to the courtyard, expecting to see lines of guards standing ready. Instead, he found only a few nervous soldiers huddled together, shifting from foot to foot. Their armor looked dull, and their faces looked even duller, eyes hollow, shoulders slumped. Archelaus' stomach twisted. "Where are the others?" he demanded, voice slicing through the morning air. The captain stepped forward slowly, helmet under his arm. He bowed low, but his voice trembled as he spoke. "My lord, many have left. Some have gone to their families. Others, they say they can't keep fighting their own people." Archelaus' eyes went wide. "Cowards!" he shouted, his words echoing across the empty courtyard. They would rather chase fairy tales of a gentle king than stand beside their true ruler. The captain swallowed hard, but did not lift his head. Archelaus turned away, pacing in tight circles. He muttered to himself, voice shaking. "They all betray me. They chase shadows. They talk about this child, this king who heals, this king who forgives. They think he can save them?" He stormed back to the captain, grabbing him by the cloak. "Tell me," Archelaus hissed, face inches from the captain's, "do you believe in this so-called king too?" The captain hesitated. His lips parted, but no words came out. Archelaus' grip tightened. "Answer me!" The captain finally looked up, eyes filled with tears. "My lord, there is something in the people's eyes when they speak of him. Hope, real hope, something I have never seen in them when they speak of you." Archelaus staggered backward as if struck. He dropped his hand, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his ears. He looked around at the courtyard, once his pride, now nearly deserted. Beyond the palace walls, the city began to stir. Children's laughter carried in the air. Families gathered around morning fires, telling stories of a different kind of king. A king who would hold their hearts, not their necks. And far away in Nazareth, a young boy helped his mother carry water. Each small step prepared him for the day he would step into the world as the true king. Gentle but unbreakable, humble yet mighty beyond measure. Archelaus stood alone, dagger dangling from his hand, its tip scraping the stone floor. His power had melted like snow under the sun, and he felt smaller than he had ever been. In that moment, he finally understood. No matter how tightly he clutched fear, he could not stop what God was building in quiet corners and small hearts. A different kingdom had already begun to rise, one he could never control. Archelaus wandered the empty palace halls long after the soldiers had gone. Rooms that once roared with feasts and music now echoed with nothing but the faint creak of doors and the soft drip of water from cracked fountains. He drifted from room to room like a restless ghost, his dagger limp in his hand. He paused in the grand dining hall. Golden plates were still stacked on the long table, dusty and untouched. He dragged his fingers across them, leaving lines in the dust like scars on his heart. "They celebrated me here once," he whispered to the shadows. "They cheered. They raised cups in my name." He sank into a chair at the head of the table, eyes lost and unfocused. But did they ever love me? He asked the empty seats. His voice trembled. Or did they only fear me? Silence answered him. A cold breeze slipped through a cracked window, lifting the corners of an old tapestry. Archelaus shivered and pulled his cloak tighter. He closed his eyes and saw the same image that haunted him every night. A baby held close by a gentle mother, guided by a quiet father slipping away in the moonlight. A king in hiding, protected by God's unseen hand. Archelaus clenched his fists. How could a child defeat me without ever lifting a sword? How could the people choose him, someone they've never met, over me? But deep down, he already knew. Beyond his palace, the city's noise had changed. There were no angry chants demanding blood, no cheers for his soldiers. Instead, soft prayers drifted from doorways, songs of hope rose from courtyards, and children's laughter carried through the narrow streets. His power, once as heavy as iron, now felt like dust slipping through his fingers. A sudden knock echoed through the hall. Archelaus jolted upright, gripping his dagger tight. A lone servant stepped in, eyes downcast. "My lord," the servant stammered, "the Romans. They have summoned you. They no longer trust your rule. They say you have failed to keep peace." Archelaus stared at him, chest rising and falling. "Failed," he repeated, the word sour on his tongue. The servant hesitated, then turned and hurried away, leaving Archelaus alone with the echo of that single word. Failed. In that echo, he heard the truth he had tried to outrun his entire life. That fear can force obedience, but it can never earn true loyalty. He rose slowly, the dagger dropping from his hand and clattering onto the floor. Archelaus felt smaller than a beggar, smaller than the very child he had once tried to destroy. The palace felt colder now, each shadow a reminder that a greater kingdom was coming, one built on love, not swords. And as the evening light faded across the floor, Archelaus finally realized his throne had never really belonged to him at all. The next morning, Archelaus dressed in silence. He pulled on his heavy cloak and the royal belt with trembling hands. His face in the polished metal plate looked pale and older than he remembered, eyes sunken, lips tight. He left the dagger behind on the floor where it still lay from the night before. Somehow, it looked small now, like a toy a child had dropped and forgotten. 2 guards, the last who remained, waited for him at the entrance. They shifted uneasily, eyes flicking everywhere but his face. Archelaus stepped past them without a word. Outside, the air was cool and sharp. The city watched in hushed silence as he walked toward the Roman governor's fortress. People leaned from windows and peered around corners, but no one cheered. No one bowed. Their eyes weren't filled with fear this time, just relief. As Archelaus passed, mothers pulled children close. Older men shook their heads. Young boys whispered about the true king who would one day come, the king who would bring peace instead of punishment. When he reached the fortress gates, Roman soldiers stood waiting. Their armor shone in the sun, and their faces stayed blank. A high official stepped forward, unrolling a small parchment. "Archelaus," he called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls, "by order of Caesar, you are to leave Judea immediately. You have failed to lead with wisdom or justice. You will be exiled, and Judea will be placed under Roman rule." The words hung in the air like a thick fog. Archelaus's knees nearly buckled. He opened his mouth to argue, but no sound came out. The official did not wait for his reply. He signaled to the guards, and they stepped forward, forming a tight circle around him. He felt smaller than ever before, like a shadow of the ruler he once imagined himself to be. As they led him away, Archelaus looked back over the rooftops. The city felt so far away already, like it was slipping out of a dream. He saw small groups gathered in doorways, families embracing, children playing freely in the streets. For a moment, he thought he saw a small boy in a distant alley. Dark hair, bright eyes, laughing as he ran to his mother. Archelaus blinked. The vision faded, but it left an ache in his chest deeper than any wound. He stumbled forward, each step taking him farther from the palace, from the throne, from everything he had tried to hold with iron fists. He understood now. Power without love is like a sword made of glass. It shatters when struck. And somewhere beyond the hills, the true king was growing stronger each day, guided by hands far greater than any earthly crown. Archelaus disappeared down the long road out of Judea, a fallen king in borrowed robes, leaving behind a kingdom he never truly owned. Archelaus rode in silence for days, escorted by Roman guards who barely spoke to him. The road twisted through dry hills and rocky valleys, each turn pulling him farther from Jerusalem, from the palace halls, the echoes of his father's voice, the weight of the crown he could no longer claim. At night they camped by small fires. Archelaus sat alone, wrapped in his cloak, staring into the flames as if they might answer the questions spinning in his mind. He replayed every harsh order, every punishment, every moment he believed fear was stronger than love. Now, with no soldiers to shout commands to and no courtiers to flatter him, the memories felt sharp and heavy. One evening, as the stars blinked softly above, he whispered into the darkness, "Was it all for nothing?" The wind brushed across his face, but no answer came. In the distance, he imagined the city he had once ruled. He saw the people gathering without fear, telling stories around lamps, praying for the true king. He pictured the child he had once feared, no longer a baby in his mother's arms, but a boy growing strong and wise in Nazareth. A king with no crown of gold. A king with no army, yet more powerful than any sword. Archelaus pressed his hands into the dirt, his head dropping to his chest. "Why did they love him more?" he croaked. "Why did they wait for him instead of following me?" In the silence, he realized the answer had always been there. They longed for hope, not terror. A shepherd, not a tyrant. Someone who knew their hearts instead of crushing them. Archelaus had never offered them that. He had only offered fear. And in the end, fear could not hold them. He felt smaller than he had ever felt before, smaller than the boy king he once imagined overthrowing, smaller than a single grain of sand beneath his fingers. As the fire crackled low, Archelaus looked up at the stars, tears sliding down his cheeks. He didn't know where his road would end, but he knew one thing now with painful clarity. A true king doesn't rule with force alone. He leads with love, humility, and sacrifice. And no matter how far he traveled, he would carry that emptiness with him, a silent echo of the throne he lost and the kingdom he never understood. In exile, Archelaus was given a small villa on the edge of a foreign city, far from Jerusalem's walls, far from the temple's chants, far from any whispers of a coming king. He spent his days wandering quiet gardens and empty halls, a once powerful ruler now invisible among strangers. The locals avoided him. They knew his story, a cruel king who lost everything. They called him the Fallen One behind closed doors. Archelaus sat for hours in a shaded courtyard, listening to the wind rattle dry leaves across the stones. Sometimes he carved lines into the dust with a stick, over and over, until his hands ached. He remembered his father's harsh lessons. Power is everything. Crush them before they rise. He once believed those words were wisdom, but now those words tasted bitter, like spoiled wine. At night he lay awake under a thin blanket, staring at the cracked ceiling. His mind drifted to the people he had once ruled. The families hiding in courtyards, the mothers whispering hope to their children, the young men praying for a true king who would bring peace. Again and again, he saw the same image, a child slipping away under moonlight, carried by parents guided by a voice stronger than any army. Did they see something I couldn't? He whispered into the dark, a power greater than my sword, a love stronger than my fear. In those silent hours, Archelaus began to understand. The people hadn't left him because they hated him. They left because they longed for something real. A king who healed the sick instead of hurting them, who washed feet instead of raising taxes, who laid down his own life instead of taking others. A king of mercy, a king of hearts. But Archelaus had offered none of that. He had built walls instead of bridges, demanded loyalty instead of earning it. And now, there were no crowds left to command, no soldiers to obey him. Only the slow, painful echo of his own regrets. Some nights he cried, without making a sound, pressing his fists to his eyes as if he could block out the truth. But it always found him. The quiet kingdom he once feared was alive and moving, carried in stories and songs, stronger than any throne he had ever sat on. And in his lonely garden, Archelaus began to see that, though he had worn a crown, he had never truly been a king. Years drifted by in the quiet villa like slow-moving clouds. Archelaus's hair turned white and his back bent under the weight of years. Years spent alone with his thoughts instead of shouts and crowns. He no longer carried a dagger. It sat in a corner of his room covered in dust, a silent symbol of a life he no longer tried to hold on to. Each morning, he shuffled into the garden, leaning on a carved cane. He watched the small birds hop between cracked stones and listened to the wind sigh through the olive trees. One afternoon, as the sun painted the sky in gold and pink, Archelaus sat on a worn bench. He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth on his face. A servant, one of the few who remained, brought him water and quietly set it beside him. She did not bow or look afraid. She simply left it there, a simple act of kindness that once would have confused him. Archelaus lifted the cup slowly. His hands trembled, but not from rage, from weakness, and perhaps something softer he never allowed himself to feel before: humility. He thought of his father's iron rule, of the day the people turned away, of the boy who escaped under moonlight and rose far beyond any throne. With a shaky breath, he whispered, "I thought power would make me strong, but it only made me alone." A tear rolled down his lined cheek. True kingship. It was never about swords or fear, he went on, his voice barely above the breeze. It was about love, mercy, serving instead of taking. He set the cup down and looked toward the fading sun. In his mind he saw the boy from long ago, now a man, walking dusty roads, touching lepers, calming storms, calling fishermen to follow. A king of quiet strength, a king of hearts. Archelaus pressed his hand to his chest. "I see now," he murmured, "but I see too late." His eyes closed again, a deep, heavy sadness wrapping around him. But somewhere in that sadness, a small flicker of peace glowed, like a single candle in a dark room. For the first time in his life, Archelaus no longer felt the need to fight or prove himself. He simply sat, listening to the wind and the soft songs of evening birds. In that final stretch of light, he finally understood that the kingdom he once tried to destroy had already won. Not with swords, but with love that could not be broken. The next morning, the servant found Archelaus still sitting on the garden bench, his head gently bowed, eyes closed. A soft breeze played with the edge of his cloak. Birds hopped nearby, unafraid, chirping their morning songs. The sun slowly rose, touching the garden stones with golden warmth. Archelaus did not move. His chest no longer rose and fell. His long, restless journey had finally ended in the quiet he never knew how to find while alive. The servant stood silently for a moment, pressing her hand to her heart. Then she covered him gently and stepped away, leaving him surrounded by the calm he had chased in all the wrong ways. Far away, in Nazareth, a carpenter's son continued to grow, learning the weight of wood in his hands, the warmth of kindness, the quiet strength of serving. Each day brought him closer to the moment he would step forward and reveal the true kingdom. A kingdom Archelaus could never have imagined. In the years to come, people would tell stories of kings and rulers who built their thrones on fear. Archelaus' name would fade into whispers of warning, a reminder of what happens when power is clutched too tightly and hearts are ruled by fear instead of love. But the story of the true king, the one Archelaus once feared, would echo across hills and deserts, through villages and cities, across seas and generations. A king who loved so deeply he would give everything to rescue hearts, not control them. Archelaus' life became a lesson in the end. God's guidance steers us even through dangerous leadership. And though Archelaus missed his chance to turn, his story now stands as a quiet voice across time, telling us that power without love is empty. But love, even without power, can change the world forever. In the stillness of that last sunrise, Archelaus finally surrendered, not to swords or soldiers, but to a truth he had run from all his life. And beyond his final breath, the true king's kingdom kept rising, stronger and brighter than any crown of gold.